So my claim to fame, you've already heard, is I'm Pastor Carey's husband. That helps to cut down on conflict right away. So let me just hear a little bit about from all of you what prompts your interest in coming to a class like this before I just dive into giving you some sort of lecture on conflict and conflict resolution. So any thoughts about what made this of interest to you?
Pastor Carey's husband.
I could just stand up here and smile. Yes.
One of the things for me is how to engage people who are not honest and open in conversation with you, like mom and dad or brother or sister or friends that you really want that relationship to be deeper, but they don't seem to engage.
Okay. All right. Very good. Yes.
There was some conflict that came up as a result of transition. And I don't think that we as a church handle that as well as we should have.
Okay. Okay. And so that's what prompts the interest.
My interest.
All right.
Bryan,
Yes.
my wife and I are from the Middle East, and the Middle East has a lot of conflict, and I'm hoping to get some positive insights on the way I could think about those issues.
I think we'll touch on some things that are related to that in the third session mostly, but yes.
How to get a person to come to agree to disagree
Okay.
and still move forward.
All right. Okay. All right. Yes.
I think sometimes it's difficult to bring people to the table to even have a conversation about what they're having a conflict about, and that may tie in with some of the transition-related discussions. So if you don't have 2 million parties, and I guess that ties to the Middle East as well.
Yeah.
What do you do?
All right. Well, that's so that's a common question that each of you have here. Okay. All right. Well, let me say a little bit about how I've organized this 3-part series. Today I wanted to talk about the dynamics of typical conflict, how people approach conflict and how it tends to go wrong. And then I want to talk a little bit about some ways to approach it differently so that we can resolve it better. And I'll talk a bit about arguing, debate, passivity, aggression, assertiveness, a variety of topics today. And then next week I'll talk about how conflict tends to stabilize and get stuck and ways to get out of those stuck kinds of positions. And then the third time I'll talk about the role of our own self-images in conflict resolution, in particular shame and self-acceptance. So that's kind of how I've organized this generally. How's that sound to you right off the bat? Okay, good enough. Yes?
Will you have any material for the people that can't make it all 3 sessions?
I was wondering if you can tape.
We are taping it right now.
Oh, good.
But I will also,
Like that.
I also have some handouts that I'll bring and that we'll have available for people to pick up at other times, I assume. Okay. So, I was going to say you're church members, so you don't have conflict. So let me start by passing out some scripture. And I printed off about 20 of these, so I'll just ask you to share them a bit, pass them around. The reason I go right to scripture with this is that the early church was very famous for having a lot of conflicts. And the Apostle Paul spent most of his time going around visiting people and trying to figure out why they couldn't get along with each other when they were supposed to be this community of love. And so we're going to refer to these particular passages. The church at Ephesus must have been in quite a bit of trouble because he addressed them quite a bit in Galatians as well. So before I talk about those scripture passages, I'm going to refer to them, but I just want you to have them in your hands. So when I do most of my work every week working with couples, and did my doctoral dissertation on couples relationship adjustments. And so I see people in their most personal, which makes us our best and often our worst with each other. And I see people try to resolve conflicts, and they tend to do so out of a couple of patterns. And the first pattern that I see is a passive pattern. And so I'll just hand out another little handout here on typical conflict styles. And again, I'll just ask you to share them. So, who thinks they're passive in their approach to conflict resolution, first of all? Okay. So, we often think that as good Christian people, we should lose in conflict. We shouldn't pay very much attention to our own wishes. We should go ahead and do what pleases other people. And passivity is a way of saying in conflict, I'll choose to lose so that you can win, and then we'll have a lot of peace, okay? And I say in the little handout there, it says peace on the outside, because what happens when we choose to lose in conflict resolution is that we've made peace with the person out there, they're pretty happy with us, but internally we're often pretty unsatisfied and even resentful. So we take the conflict outside and we just put it inside ourselves. So that passivity is against self for the sake of external peace. Have you seen that happen anywhere? All the time. Yeah. And the goal of a person who's being passive is to control the emotions of the other person so that those emotions calm down, because that emotional stuff is really uncomfortable. It makes me anxious, and so I'd rather that you're not upset with me, please. And I'll just do lots of things to please you on the outside and make sure that you're calming down, because that makes me uncomfortable. And the anxiety about interaction, about external conflict, also makes me want to withdraw from it and avoid dealing with it at all. We call that unwillingness to deal with conflict at all stonewalling. Heard that term before? I want to talk to you about this issue we have with our finances. Well, I'm a little busy with work issues right now, and I can't quite get around to that. Can we have a little conversation about it next Tuesday at 7 p.m.? I'm not sure about my schedule, but I'll get back to you about that, okay? Because things are pretty tight right now. Yeah, but the bank's been calling. I know, I just hate to put this off, but you've seen this happen. The other thing that people who are passive in conflict resolution do is they just don't talk very much about things generally. So if you want to engage them in a conversation, they won't tell you very much about what's going on. They'll give you brief answers, and they're short to the point, or they just don't talk. They just don't reveal much of themselves. Okay? So, I want you to think a little about who you are, who the people that you engage with are in these issues, and then we'll identify some ways of being a little different. The other tendency of people in conflict resolution is to do the kind of debate style of conflict resolution. How many of you were debaters in high school or college? There you go, debate team people. How'd you do?
I won.
And that's the point. That's the whole point of debates, isn't it? To have a winner. Of course, when you have a winner, you also have a loser. And what's it like to be the winner?
Great.
It just feels so good, doesn't it? What's it like to be the loser?
Not so.
Not so fun, yeah. Not so fun. We have public discourse these days around debates. Have any of you watched any of the televised debates? What kind of thoughts do you have about those? Aside from getting into the political points, just the process of the debates, what do you think about that?
That's not even a debate.
I'm sorry?
That's not even a debate. They're screaming at each other.
It's not even a debate.
Right.
But,
For
Just-
entertainment. Entertainment or attention.
Main
Getting
calling.
attention, getting votes.
It's not a discussion.
There's no discussion.
No discussion.
So people are just making points, they're getting more intense emotionally, they're yelling. They're not having a rational conversation, are they? No. We used to have debates.
Right.
Some of you were trained in debates. And how did debates work differently than what we see on television?
They're
Well,
organized.
you come to a conclusion.
Come to conclusions.
There's an organization, each person gets a turn for an understood amount of time.
It's structured so that no one dominates it by overpowering another person. Each team gets their turn. There's order to it. I'm sorry.
You don't interrupt other people.
Don't interrupt others. You don't even get the chance to interrupt others because there's this structured, designed time for each person to talk about what they've researched and reviewed in order to make a reasonable argument about things, a logical argument.
And are there performance rules where you're not insulting to one another and belittling of?
Those of you who were trained in debate, I wasn't.
Yeah, the other thing is it's issue oriented, it's not personal.
Right, you walk away as friends at the end of it.
Right. Okay. Wouldn't that be wonderful to see something like that on television?
Amazing.
Instead, what we have are people who take the second conflict style, which is an aggressive style. And the aggressive style is, I'm going to win. And I don't care about you. And if I don't like you very much, I'm going to make sure that you lose, and I might even rub it in a little bit. So the aggressive style is for self and against other. When the passive style is against self and for other, this is just the reverse. I'm going to win and you're going to lose. I'm against you. And my main goal is not to manage your emotions because I really don't care about your emotions. My main goal is to get my own emotions out and control you in some way, to make this a power-oriented resolution of conflict. I'm going to win and I'm going to take control over you if I can. That's aggression. Where anxiety with the passive person causes them to withdraw from conflict, shut down, not say anything, and put their conflict inside. Anxiety for the aggressive person causes them to intensify, to try to take control, to try to manage the other person and have power play and make them really hot emotionally in their engagement style. So they tend to escalate more and more and more in their style. And one of the things that we've learned about people and how the brains work is that the more we escalate emotionally, we tend to go like this, the more we escalate emotionally in this primitive part of the brain that we often talk about as fight or flight oriented. The passive person flees, I want to avoid it. The aggressive person fights, I want to approach you and attack you. The more intensely cranked up that emotional state is, the more shut down the prefrontal cortex, the reasonable, rational, most evolved part of our brains are. They just shut down. Because think about it, if you're in danger, you don't want to sit there and think, let me be rational about this and pause and gather my facts and analyze them and come up with a solution that makes sense. You want to say, that's a tiger, let's go. So your body is set up and your brain is set up to shut down reason when emotion is turned on. So what tends to happen in conflict is we have an escalating reactive emotional process. And the more we have that process, the less functional we become. One of the first people who studied families and how they operate emotionally was a guy by the name of Murray Bowen. He was a psychiatrist, I believe he was with George Washington University in D.C. area. And he and his colleagues got people together to study families where one of their members was schizophrenic. And he had these families live with the team in the treatment program, and they observed to see what was the difference between the families where the schizophrenic family member was hospitalized repeatedly and the families where the schizophrenic person was rarely hospitalized.
Can you take a second to describe to me what a schizophrenic person is?
Sure. Schizophrenia is the most serious mental health disease that there is, and it is a disease that's marked by two things. One is hallucinations, and hallucinations are your sensory information coming into your brain is misread. So you smell, taste, hear, touch, and feel things that are not there. And you feel bugs crawling on your skin, or hear somebody talking to you, things like that.
Thank you.
That's one of the pieces. The other piece is delusions. And delusions are beliefs that are very bizarre. So they're not just strange beliefs, they're extremely strange beliefs. So when I was a pastor in Albuquerque, I had a fellow walk into my office one day and he said, "The aliens have been talking to me through this cavity in my tooth, through the radio waves in this silver, and they told me to drive across the country and come to your office." That's a delusion. I had a person in my office say, "I know my wife is seeing other people because I saw the birds fly a certain way over my house the other day." So what happens with schizophrenia is the brain is not operating properly.
Are
Yes.
you taking into consideration medication of people being hospitalized versus not being hospitalized in frequency?
Yes, this was in the 1930s, and we
Oh,
didn't
that-
have the
that-
neuroleptic,
yeah.
the antipsychotic medications that we have available today. And so it was much harder to control those things at that time. And so they had these two groups of people, and they observed them, and they saw that in the families where the person was hospitalized a lot, one person, I'm going to show you a mobile hanging here from my hand. One person would wiggle emotionally and get very upset, and it would ripple around the rest of the family. And they didn't have a way to calm it down. It just was highly reactive. One person would get emotionally intense, express a lot of emotion, and the next person would try to calm them down or argue with them. There was this intense emotionality to these families. The families where people were not hospitalized very much, somebody would wiggle emotionally, get very upset, and the other people would relax and stay fairly calm and not get too caught up in it and try to be reasonable. So emotional reactivity is one of the hallmarks of unhealthy human community relationships. Let me just pause and see if you have questions about that before I go any further. Yes?
So let me make sure I've got this straight.
Yeah.
The families are more rational when the schizophrenic person is there most of the time. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that the families who were the least emotionally reactive, who were, each individual was in control of their own emotions and managing themselves rather than reacting to the intensity of another person's emotions. In those families, the schizophrenic was not hospitalized very often.
Okay.
So this family system itself was much healthier. Yes?
Okay, but then back to your original point, what if they were passive and kept those emotions inside and didn't release them?
Well, passivity is equally reactive as aggression is. We tend to think of passivity as not reactive because people aren't acting their emotions out on the outside so much. Other than
So what you're saying is even though they reacted in control and were passive, they must have had some other ways to release this unusual behavior, because there must have been some frustrations within the family. They must have had open communication or some other dialogue to release.
Right, there were obviously frustrations. Think you've got one of your family members who's telling you bizarre things and hearing and seeing and smelling things that are not there, and schizophrenic people without medication are often very highly emotionally intense people. So it's very easy to be reactive to emotionally intense people, right? But the families who were less reactive had the skills of each individual managing themselves and not getting caught up in conflict between other people. And I'll focus on getting caught up in conflict between other people next week in that session. Okay? So this process of emotional reactivity is one of the things that keeps conflicts going the most in our communities. If I say to Pastor Kerry, that was a really terrible sermon you preached today. And anybody have anything to say about that?
I heard it was great.
There. So we can get emotional intensity can create emotional reactivity and choosing sides. And the choosing sides we call triangulation, and I'll talk about that next time. So, yes?
So emotional control is different than passivity.
Yes.
That's I guess what I was getting to.
Emotional control.
Yeah, let me give you, I'll put us in a terrible light here, and I'll say, give you an example. If I go home tonight and I walk in the door and my wife says to me, you know, you never clean the kitchen, I could say, I cleaned the kitchen on Tuesday and Thursday, and besides, you never cleaned the kitchen. I could react aggressively back to her, or I could passively react to her. I could say, well, I'll deal with it later, and then go in my room and sulk and decide to not talk to her for a couple of days. You think a couple of days is So I can passively react just as much as I can aggressively react. If I'm having a strong emotional reaction to that, I'm still reactive. If I'm there and she says the same thing to me and I say, whoa, I need to keep myself from reacting to that. I need to not take this personally. She just told me something bad about me. She just criticized me, told me I didn't clean the kitchen. But I'm going to depersonalize this a little bit. I'm going to just keep myself calm and not react to it. I need to go in the other room for a few minutes and listen to a little music or calm down or do whatever I was going to do when I walked in the door. Okay, I got myself in a more comfortable place. Now I can come back and say, you seemed kind of intense when I walked in the door today. Is it about the kitchen and those things, or something else going on in your life today that's creating some of the emotion? Now that's pretty hard to get to that place of being calm and more reasonable when we're attacked or things are emotionally intense.
Well, what music did you listen to do that?
like some of that. Yeah. What works for me might not work for you. So I'm going to talk about that process of calming ourselves down we call self-soothing. And so self-soothing is a process of first depersonalizing other people's behavior and then calming our own minds, emotions, and bodies down. So let me say a word about depersonalization for a second. And tell me if this isn't getting, is this of interest? Are we getting at things that are...
Yeah,
That's good.
So depersonalization. Anybody ever seen or taken a Rorschach test?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Can you just say something about what it is and what you saw when you took it? Anybody? Yeah.
It's a known set of images
Yes.
of whatever you think it is. They have no intrinsic meaning.
Yes.
The only meaning of the picture is what the viewer puts on it. And that's the point.
Well put. Well put. So they're ink blots, and somebody just took some ink and dropped it on a paper, folded the paper up, moved it around a little bit, and opened it up. It's a mirror image of an ink blot. And it's used in psychiatry and psychology for testing purposes. And if I had one with me, which I don't because I left them in my office, you'd see this funny looking shaped ink blot on there, and I'd say to you, what is it? And I wish I had something to do that.
It's a butterfly.
Well, imagine.
Yeah. Imagine I get an ink blot that looks like that. What is it?
A butterfly.
What is it?
Antlers.
Turkey tail.
Turkey tail. What you see comes out of who you are, which is the point. We need to find out who people are, and so what they tell us about what they see tells us who they are. In the same way, when people relate to us, the way they relate to us is not about us. Now, this is a little bit of a hard concept to get, because we tend to think that if we're nice to people, they'll be nice to us. We're mean to people, they'll be mean to us. If we do things to please people, they'll be pleased. But the way that people relate to us is not about us. That's depersonalization. And realizing that, when my wife says to me, "You never clean the kitchen," that may be about me. If I'm honest with myself, I need to check. Is that about me? But the way she's doing it at that moment in time is not about me. Because that's about some other things going on in her world. So it's important to recognize in conflict resolution that we need to depersonalize how the other person is behaving, because it's not about us. What do you think of that?
Pretty good, yeah.
It's a challenge.
It's true.
It's a challenge, isn't
But
it?
what if it is about us, if there's certain expectations?
Can
Like
you
in
say
in relationships, sometimes there's certain expectations, right? Like people that like, and it's based on their past history, like how you were brought up. So there might be the expectation, I'll just go with the traditional values. Like you cook dinner and have it ready on the table for when somebody comes home. Or cleaning or washing or certain chores like that.
Okay.
You know, so I'm just wondering, is there some sort of, is it still just all about us, or is there some, because we do interact with each other, I mean, we're very connected to each other.
Let me give you an extreme example. Let's say there's a guy sitting there in that chair who just got out of prison for multiple assaults, and the parole board didn't want him to get out, and he's sitting there, and you go over and punch him in the nose, and then you punch Pastor Carey in the nose.
Instead, or?
Both, punch both in the nose, okay?
What's the reaction?
Are you going to get the same behavior? She's pretty tough, you might. You know you're not going to get the same behavior. Our behavior doesn't cause the other person's behavior.
Yeah.
People behave out of who they are and their own character. So when you say, so tell me more about your question. When you say,
Well, I mean, what did you say again? That we're responsible for our own actions, and that, what was your point? How did you state that again?
I'm not sure what you're
The
referring
way
to.
they relate to us is not about us.
The way they relate to us is not about us. It's
Right,
about them.
right.
But we all live in community. We all live with each other,
Yes, we do.
right? So,
Yes.
But there's issue and there's emotion. So he's talking about, yeah, we still need to work through the issues, but we need to work through the issues without being emotionally charged. And so that's what I hear being discussed here.
That's
Well, we
part.
still have to work through it. If your husband expects you to have dinner on the table and it's not working for you, you need to talk about that.
Now she
say,
just
"Honey."
needs dinner on the table.
That's somebody in
So, looking at this as an example, can I ask another question, maybe to get to the point of what you're talking about, not necessarily in an emotionally charged setting, but say there are two parties that have a conflict because they both want the same resource, and that conflict is going to be there regardless of how they react.
Yeah.
And so you're asking about how to deal with that conflict,
Is
and you're talking about
that
how to
accurate?
react
Is
to
that
the
what you're
conflict.
asking?
it was more of a theoretical question. It wasn't, it was just, I understand where you're coming from. understand.
You're asking, when is it about
I
me?
do,
instead
well, I
of-
do
when
think
is
it
about
is,
me?
I do
Well-
think it is important to speak your truth and to speak it in love. And when something happens that you're not happy with, to let that person know, and like you did, you said, you know, hey, what's going on? Why did you react that way? Why did you ask, you know? So I get that.
Okay.
But I do, and I do think our childhood, our past behaviors, how we were brought up, has a big influence on how we relate to other people and our expectations with other people. But yeah, no, I get what you're saying.
So let me say another word about this, what if it is about us. Say I was the guy who didn't clean the kitchen all the time, and she confronts me. Now, I have a responsibility to be honest with myself about these things, right? The fact that she dealt with it in that way is about her. If I'm not doing my responsibilities, that's about me. And I don't know how much I want to get into this today. The third session, I'm going to talk about how we deal with people's shame-based views of us, or our own shame-based views of ourselves, and how we deal with a more realistic view of ourselves, a real self, and how that plays a role in conflict as well. Yes.
So are you saying then if you say, well, I have an issue, and the other person has a passive approach to it, so they kind of disappear, that conflict never gets resolved. So you may respond in your own method, of whichever it might be, but the other person is also not taking responsibility then either.
Right.
Right?
Right. So for the passive person, if we go to the scripture passages, the top one, speak the truth in love, you mentioned, would be the goal for the passive person. Instead of stonewalling, it would be to what we call in family therapy level, put things on the table, level with the other person, speak the truth, don't hide it, but do it in love. So you can read that particular passage, or some of you have it, some of you don't, but so Ephesians 4, but speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth and building itself up in love. So the more we're honest with each other about things, the more things can be addressed and dealt with, and the more we can function as a community. If we tend to hide what's important to us, or get passive about it, so it doesn't get addressed, or get passive-aggressive about it, like there's a vote, everybody votes, half the congregation doesn't show up because they're passive, and then they come back later and they say, well, nobody asked me about that. Passive-aggressive, it doesn't get things addressed. Everything's underground and not dealt with. So speaking the truth is a really important piece of conflict resolution. Now, speaking the truth in love is a little different than just speaking the truth, because we have people who will say, well, I'm brutally honest. That brutal word, that catches your attention.
Speaking the German, yeah.
Yes, I know about that. My mother's family's German, so we learned how to do that. Speaking the truth in love is different than being brutally honest, because being brutally honest often means, let me tell you about what I really don't like about you, or about this situation. It's a focus on complaining and the negativity of things. So speaking the truth in love is about saying our piece, but saying it with self-control and not talking about the other person. Because all those you messages, what do they say when you do a you messages? There are more fingers pointing at you. And you messages create conflict. I messages, speaking about myself, my own truth, diffuses conflict. Yes?
So I've had difficulty with women.
I know all about it.
When I say, you know, it hurts me when you say that.
Mm-hmm.
And they start to cry. And I don't know how to shift that. So to me, that's a little less obvious than, the you. But how do you shift from, I'm not being brutally honest, I'm trying to say what's going on for me, but then I shut down when they cry. It's like, okay.
So there's,
and then I walk away.
there's the emotional reactivity piece. So what you did first, you spoke up, you leveled, you put it on the table, mostly spoke about yourself.
Yeah.
The person cried, and you had an emotional reactivity to the crying.
What do you say?
So
I mean, I
how
don't even know what
How
to
do the men react?
So
If
how
you say the
people-
women start crying, so how do the men react?
I
So
don't know.
Oh, you
let's say
have
that. So let's say the person starts to cry, and instead of feeling like, oh, I can't stand this, or this is uncomfortable, or I have to leave, you stayed there with them,
Yeah.
and you waited that out, and
And then what?
expressed concern for their feelings, or, and
You
then
have to
after they
apologize.
went through their emotional process, tried to talk about it again.
Okay.
You basically apologize.
Well,
Right? That's massive.
See,
I don't know if you apologize. If you were speaking the truth,
You don't know.
Right.
you want to apologize
That's
for
what I
what you
mean.
said, or you
well,
can-
to make her feel bad.
No.
I'm sorry you felt bad
Yeah.
about that. I still need us to get this resolved.
Right.
Because when you behave in this way, it does hurt. When you call me a stupid jerk, it hurts my feelings, and it makes our relationship more difficult. You may cry about that, but we need to talk about it. Okay? Does that answer
Yeah, that-
well?
Yeah, whether it's successful or not. Again, I mean, there's many levels.
So when we're passive, we
Good for
want to
today.
control the other person's emotions. That's our goal, is to control their emotions, keep them from being angry, anxious, sad, scared, hurt. We try to manage them,
Yeah.
and that approach is a passive approach to conflict resolution. We don't have the ability to change other people's emotions. I wish I did. Because I'm in this business. I can teach people how to manage their own emotions, but I cannot change other people's emotions. Yes?
Do you buy into the idea that some of our reactions are cultural? Like people, just using my neighbor who's Greek, she just is very expressive.
Yes.
And then there's the more stern,
Any Norwegians? Scandinavians?
and so that's learned behavior.
Yes. That's the level of emotional expression is what we're talking about. So, yeah, if you go to an Italian family gathering and you walk in the door, people are intense and they're loud and they're yelling at each other, and sometimes they call each other names, and 5 minutes later they're laughing and slapping each other on the back. And those of you who are Scandinavian are going, how can they possibly do this? But for them, the set point of emotional expression is much higher than for Finns or Japanese folks. And so they don't take that seriously. They're not reacting emotionally to it in the sense of it affecting them deeply. Whereas if you're in a Danish family and you're sitting around the dinner table and somebody says, you remember something about Uncle Joe from 10 years ago, everybody looks sideways and, everybody goes home, goes to bed that night dreaming about it. And upset about that little comment about Uncle Joe from something. You know what I'm talking about? So nobody says anything in terms of emotional expression, but the internal emotional reactivity can be very high. So it's not a cultural issue that's the reactivity piece. The cultural issue is the emotional expression piece. But if you're used to a certain level of emotional expression, and you're dealing with somebody who comes out of a different family system or different culture, you're going to have a hard time with that, because that level is going to make you anxious. Whether it's too high or too low, you're going to be uncomfortable with it unless you know how to manage your anxiety and self-soothing. What was that song we were going to listen to? Yeah. Unless you have ways of keeping yourself calmed down in those settings. When we first teach beginning counselors how to be with the client in the room, they're terrified. They walk in and they sit down, and there's a one-way mirror, and there are people watching how this interaction goes, and the person cries in the office, and they go back into the room and they sit down and talk to everybody. They thought, it was so upsetting to me, and they go home and they dream about it, and eventually they're able to learn how to keep themselves calm and comfortable when people are having intense emotional experiences in front of them. But it's a practiced skill to soothe ourselves and keep ourselves calm. How are we doing on time?
20 minutes.
Way too much. This will never do. Let's see. So let me say pick out another Ephesians passage. The second one, be angry, yet don't sin. I talk to a lot of Christians who say, be angry. That's not what, we're not supposed to be angry. Be angry, but don't sin. This is for the aggressive people. Yes?
Can I go back 1 second?
Sure.
So what we need to do is keep ourselves calm, but not passive, right?
Yes.
Okay, what's the medium? You didn't talk about assertiveness.
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
That's coming up, but I wanted to just hit this one on this passage on aggressiveness for a minute. So aggressive people, again, are trying to control other people. They get their anxiety or their anger, either one encourages this kind of hot, intense emotion, and their goal of getting out of this is to just relieve themselves of some feelings or control somebody else. And so they need to learn how to allow themselves to be angry, but keep it under control so they don't sin, so they don't do things to hurt other people. Because there are two key skills we teach people in marital conflict resolution: leveling, and the other is called editing. Some things are better left unsaid. Right? Because if we do name calling or it escalates and we do damage. And I brought some things from the Gottman Institute. John Gottman, I'm bouncing around here a little bit. John Gottman was a leading marital researcher in the country and still is. And he was at DU for a while. Now he's at the University of Washington. And he was the first one who brought couples into the laboratory and studied them and observed what could predict divorce. And he did years of study, and now we can predict divorce within 20 minutes by observing couples do conflict resolution. And if we see one of four things consistently in that interaction, we can predict with a high level of accuracy whether people are going to be divorced in 3 years. And those four things are called the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The end of the world is coming. I brought some handouts on that. Sorry. But I'll hold off on that. And the four things are around the passive people: stonewalling, refusing to talk about things; defensiveness, when somebody brings up things, taking it personally and defending yourself; criticism from the aggressive people; and then going a step further, contempt from the aggressive people. Contempt. And the difference between criticism and contempt is criticism's about what you're doing and contempt's about who you are. And if we see one of those four things going on consistently, people are not editing out the criticism or contempt, we know that people are in trouble. Relationships are going to break down. Yes?
What about apathy?
Apathy is a passivity, is not caring. Because we actually all do care. If I said,
It's not one of the four.
no, no, it's not, but it's not one of the four that predicts divorce, but it's a form of stonewalling, because people do care about things. If Carrie says to me, where would you like to go for dinner tonight? Oh, it doesn't matter to me, anything is fine. And then we go and we have Italian and it gives me heartburn, which it does. I'm not leveling, I'm not being truthful about things. If we check in with ourselves, we do have preferences about things, all of us, and they're not the same preferences. And I'll talk about how we resolve that here in a minute. So, Ephesians, be angry, but don't sin. And so then, putting away falsehood, let us all speak the truth to our neighbors, for we're members of one another. Be angry, but don't sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger, and don't make room for the devil. Don't harbor your anger so much that it creates evil within you. There's a little thing on thieves must be about stealing rather than labor and work honestly with their own hands. I don't know why that little passage got in there, but there it is. Most of this is about who the church should be to each other. Let no evil come out of your mouths. Edit it out. But only what's useful for building up as there's need, so that your words may give grace to those who hear. And don't grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with which you were marked with a seal for the day of redemption. Put away all bitterness and wrath and anger and wrangling and slander. Is this TV? Together with all malice, and be kind to one another. Tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ has forgiven you. So editing out all that hostility. Because if we do the aggressive things, particularly in our couple relationships, we study couples again. We know that if you call somebody a name, it takes 5 repair efforts to get back to where you were before that event happened. 5 efforts at making peace, showing concern for the other person's feelings, etc., just to get back to where you were to start with. So editing out the hostility is a key piece of conflict resolution. Now I want to talk a little bit about assertiveness. How am I doing on time? 15 minutes. So I often will draw a little diagram, and I'll put the passive people over here, and you can read what's on your charts. And I'll put the aggressive. Am I spelling this right? Probably.
Got the R, AGGR.
And I'll put assertive up here at the top because I think it's what I want to encourage in you. And I put a little arrow with a spring on it. Passive people, the more passive they are, the more they stretch themselves to ignore what's comfortable for them, the more likely they are to spring over and become aggressive. Anybody know anything about that? Assertiveness is I win and you win. It's a win-win attempt at conflict resolution. Now, right away, everybody goes, that's not always possible. I'm going to suggest that it almost always is. So it's a win-win. It's for myself, and it's for you. And assertiveness is not about the you messages that aggressive people give. It's again about the I. It's not about the no messages, no talk at all that passive people do. It's about I messages, talking about self, revealing self. What we often do in conflict, we talk about the other person, we talk about the topic, but we don't really reveal ourselves very much. And so assertiveness is about revealing self. It's about talking about, I would like to go to Mexican tonight, not Italian. That's an assertive message. It's talking about myself. I didn't say, and you're a jerk because you want Italian, and you know that I get heartburn. That's aggressive. I didn't say, oh, yes, we'll go to Italian, even though it'll give me the heartburn and all. She never does remember that. She's so, oh, I'm caring. You know, she doesn't pay attention to my needs.
You do that pretty well.
Lots of practice. Lots of practice. Come from a very passive family. Lots of practice. It's, here's what I would like. Okay? And it's I speech balanced with listening. And not listening on, like you do in a debate, where you listen for what the weakness of their argument is so that you can quickly come back with a counter argument. That's not listening, that's debating. Listening for understanding is getting to the place where you can tell what's important to the other person and why, and you can tell them what's important to them and why. So you said you like Italian because you love those meatballs at that, what's the name of that place? Parma?
Yeah.
And that wine that goes with it, it's just such a wonderful flavor, and just the atmosphere of that place you like because after a long day of work it's so peaceful. Is that right?
That's right.
So
That's the one
listening
in
for
Louisville.
understanding and revealing that you understand is a key piece of conflict resolution. It's very different than debating, where you're making your point and the other person's countering. So oftentimes I see people walk into my office with shovels. Each of them's got a shovel and they're going to dig a hole about their position and they're going to hunker down into their position, into the foxhole, and you can't get them out of it. You know, here's why we should do what I say, and let me just dig it a little deeper. Well, here's what I think and why I'm right, and they'll dig it a little deeper. Yes.
So, I think I'm pretty good at, on average, at going back and forth a lot between aggressive and passive. I'm guessing that does not mean I'm assertive.
Don't feel too alone. Yes.
I'm guessing that does not mean I'm assertive, but we have certain personalities. We've grown, there's 46 years of environment that's been, and genes that's gone into this body of mine.
Yeah.
What are the best tools that the psychology and psychiatry have come up with for teaching people to change who they are at that level?
Well, we do tend to have our family backgrounds and our cultures that teach us how to deal with these things, and it's primarily our growing up families that teach us how to deal with conflict. If we come out of really high conflict aggressive families, we either learn to be aggressive or we're hiding out and we're avoiding conflict at all costs. If we come out of very avoidant families, then we don't know how to have a conversation about anything. We just keep it all inside and run away from any conflict at all. So we tend to get trained in one or the other of these styles, or a passive-aggressive style, mixing the two. Not that many of us get into that balance. It's sort of like the second commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. We're better at loving ourselves, or better at loving our neighbor, trying to get it in balance, to love us both. That's a lifelong challenge of learning how to grow in love. That's the point of the scripture, is to be renewed in your mind and be transformed into the image of Christ, so that you learn how to do this second commandment, right? The greatest commandment is like to the first. So learning how to do it involves a variety of skills. Self-soothing is the first skill. Leveling, being honest with people about what's going on, is the second. Editing out the hostility and the negativity is the third.
I'm sorry, would you say those again? Self-soothe, editing, and I missed one.
Self-soothing, leveling,
Leveling.
speaking the truth, editing out the hostility. Those are three of the key skills. We talked about listening. So speech about self, revealing, I speech. Listening for understanding in the other person, so you can deeply understand what's important to them. That's another piece of the skill. And then another piece of assertiveness, aside from speaking I messages, is the piece that's about what you decide you will do and what you will not do. Passive people try to control the aggressive person's emotions. Aggressive people try to control the passive person entirely. Assertive people control themselves. Self-control, which is the third piece in here, fruits of the Spirit. Yes.
So I'll try and apply what I heard. So I'm having a hard time applying what I heard you say to become assertive. I'm hearing what I'm supposed to do, but I'm not managing to translate that into an answer to my question, which was, what are the tools that psychology and psychiatry have come up with that work best at helping me change into those? And I hear what you want me to do, I'm just not hearing the process to get there.
Well, let's say you were a passive person and you would get anxious about us having a conversation. I would teach you how to make yourself comfortable when you were anxious. So that's the self-soothing piece first. And then I would ask you to learn how to identify your own wishes, because passive people are very much out of touch with their own wishes and in touch with what they think will reduce conflict. So I'd invite you to say, what kind of ice cream do you think you might like? If I were trying to get you to pay attention to yourself rather than others, I'd start training you in how to check in with you. And I'd ask you those kind of pointed questions so that if we were having an Italian or Mexican kind of conversation, I'd ask you, have you ever been to either of those kind of restaurants? Do you remember what it was like to be at one of those restaurants? Do you remember liking anything at one of those restaurants? What do you think about one of those questions? Anything that's coming to mind?
So I guess I'm struggling a bit, and I don't want to take over the conversation.
I don't mind. I think people are getting things out of it. Yeah.
So I guess I'm looking for a label. Let's say I decide to go and spend my hard-earned money on a therapist.
Yeah.
And they're going to bring a certain tool set to the table. My guess is that some of them are going to have good tool sets, some of them are going to have less good tool sets.
Yeah.
What is the label that I should be looking for when they put their shingle out there? Is it
the label of the mental health professional, you mean?
well, that could be it. So
the type of therapy they do.
Yeah, exactly.
So what this is called behavioral therapy.
So it is, okay.
Yeah. So we're changing behaviors.
Behavioral cognitive therapy?
Cognitive therapy is changing thoughts, and behavioral therapy is changing behaviors. And sometimes we have to do both. So these are skill-based kinds of therapies. Yeah. So cognitive behavioral therapy would teach you assertiveness training.
Thank you.
And it would teach if we did cognitive therapy with the passive person, we would teach them how to confront their fear that if they spoke up, that the conflict would escalate and some horrible catastrophe would occur. And we would talk with them about, well, when you've been in conflicts before, did a horrible catastrophe occur? Oh, it was terrible. What was horrible about it? We would walk through the thought process, and then we would do certain behaviors that would reduce anxiety. So the person might learn how to have a conflict in the office, and that's behavioral therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy, and we would do assertiveness training. With the aggressive person, we would do social skills training. We would teach them how to not just react out of their emotion to get the relief and the release of an intense emotional experience and control over somebody. We would teach them how to focus on what their outcome they desired was, how keep themselves calm, how to solve problem solving, how to try things out, how to evaluate whether they occur or not, things like that. Yes?
But I think more to the point of one thing is going through therapy is one way of doing it, but it's clearly not the only way.
Sure.
Is it people buy self-help books, or some people do journaling, or
Yeah.
some people take a certain period of time and work through that each day as to how did this go, what can I do differently, and try and gather some information. But, spending some time doing it, it doesn't necessarily have to be therapy.
Right, often I will just say to somebody, why don't you buy the assertiveness book, Your Perfect Right, and just read through it at first, so that you get an idea of what passivity is about and how to overcome it, and what aggression is about, how to overcome it, and what assertiveness is. Yeah.
I want to put a plug in for contemplative practices, because they,
Excellent.
in terms of the self-soothing, just the results are amazing.
They are wonderful. And I often teach people mindfulness practices, which is now really getting a lot of inroads into psychology, and or meditative practices, which have both short-term effects at calming and focusing on the here and now, and long-term effects on stress reduction. Yes, I could go on about that.
I find that with so many things, practice makes perfect. I live
Yes.
alone. I have a home office. I do not interface with people much. I used to be great at doing assertive stuff, but I've lost the ability, the same as I've lost the ability to drive in fast, aggressive traffic. What settings do you have creative ideas about if I wanted to kind of get weekly practice, what settings I could put myself in?
Go to church. I think assertiveness is a practiced skill, and it's just about, first of all, checking in with yourself about your preferences and then learning to express them. And it can be as simple as you go to the donut shop and they say, what would you like? And you say, well, what do I like? Or you go stand in front of they say, what would you like? And you say, I need to take a few minutes and think about that. And you look at things and you imagine what it would be like to eat them. And then you say, I think I might like that. And you act on it, even if you're not sure. And acting on what you guess you might like will get you more in touch with what you do like. Oh, I didn't like that after all. Now I know I don't like that. So assertiveness is not just speaking up about what you want. It's acting on what you want and refusing to do what you don't want. Because we only have power over ourselves. How are we doing here?
We're done.
We're done.
So,
I think that was pretty clear. So we'll have 2 more sessions. Next week, I intend to talk about how conflict gets stabilized and stuck and how to get out of it. And the 3rd week, I intend to talk about how our sense of self and our ways of behaving toward other people and ascribing value to them or devaluing them play into ongoing conflict as well, and how to resolve those.
Is this basically how people test on the Myers-Briggs situation, or is that different?
No, I could talk about the Myers-Briggs, but Myers-Briggs is I won't talk about the Myers-Briggs. Could just start in on that. Thank you.